Hello friends, my name is JJ, and why does Balatro, the game that is sweeping the nation, feature baseball cards, hanging chads, and guys dressed like Ted Kaczynski? I would say it is because it is part of a new wave of indie games that I'm gonna call Americana-core. You know, games that are packed with sly, sentimental, and irreverent references to American culture as part of their general theme. And today, we are going to look at some of those references that Balatro makes. Over the last decade or so, I feel like we've seen a real slew of pretty iconic Americana core games. And what is particularly interesting to me is how many of the most iconic ones were made by Canadians, which of course just helps reinforce my life's thesis that Canadians share American culture and very much recognize it as something of our own. I mean, just consider. Cuphead, which came out in 2014 and was a heartfelt homage to early 20th century American animation, was made by two brothers from Saskatchewan. Pizza Tower, a hilarious 2023 send-up of 90s era American pizza culture, was made by a French-Canadian guy from Quebec. And now Balatro, made by a fellow from sunny Winnipeg. But what is Balatro all about exactly, you ask? Well, that is a very good question. And I guess before I can do any analyzing, I will either have to play the game for myself or get a Zoomer to explain it to me. And I think I know which one of those two options I prefer. Okay, Greg, so what is the objective of Balatro?
Balatro, I'm so glad you pronounced it properly, because I know you've intentionally been trying to get it to stick in your head as Bagalago or something. So,
it took a lot of restraint to not do that, yes.
It was like a 4D boomer chess move you've been using just to personally annoy me. Balatro, yeah. So the goal of Balatro is to get a certain score, right? And that score changes every level, and it typically increases as you go through the rounds. And you score these points by making hands, poker hands, flushes, straights, royal flushes, pairs, two pairs, that kind of thing.
And it uses just normal cards, right?
Yeah, so you start off with a deck of 52 cards. That's a standard playing card deck. As you go, you might buy more cards. Maybe you buy a bunch of threes, and then you can ensure that you're going to draw a hand of 4 threes. Then you can make 4 of a kinds, which are very powerful. Sometimes you'll buy tarot cards, which affect your deck in certain ways. But you start off with just a standard deck of playing cards.
Tell me more about these special cards.
Well, there's two main special decks, right? There's your tarot cards, which you're familiar with all the major arcana of tarot. We're making a tarot deck. And each tarot arcana does a different thing. The other deck is planet cards. Each planet card levels up a certain hand that you're playing. And then the final sort of twist is that there's jokers. Each joker affects your deck in different ways. And you've obviously seen the jokers. They're very beautifully done pieces of art that reference Americana, which is why primarily I think you're interested in it.
What role do they play exactly in the game itself?
So each joker affects the run in different ways, and typically buffs whatever hands you're playing. So maybe you get there's a blackboard joker. That's like a joker which has been scrolled on a blackboard, and it increases your score if you have spades or clubs. Every single card references the Joker in some ways. You'd like baseball card. It's like it's a baseball card, but he's dressed like a Joker. There's a trading card, which lets you discard your cards and trade them in for other cards. There's also driver's license, which is clearly Western style driver's license with the Joker on it. They play with cards in all kinds of ways.
Greg, would you say that the game is a love letter to American card culture?
No. You would say that, so I explicitly wouldn't say that.
Okay.
So Balatro is a roguelike. JJ, are you familiar with these roguelikes?
I've heard that term used, but I don't know what that means. What is a rogue, and why is it like it?
Rogue was a game made in the 1980s or something. It was made with ASCII art. Do you know those kinds of games where you play an @ symbol walking around? In that game, when you die, you lose all your progress, you go back to the beginning. It's kind of like an arcade game. Completely skill-based. There's no grinding to be done. From that, there's roguelikes. Roguelikes are like Rogue in the sense that when you die, you go back to the beginning. Once you lose, it's done. It's over. You lose everything. It's impossible to talk about Balatro or its cultural impact without recognizing that the roguelike format is incredibly addictive. It rewards playing over and over again and incrementally learning. This is why it's so addictive. This is why so many young people are really into Balatro.
Okay, that's great, Greg. I feel like you've given me a lot to work with. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So, as Greg very explicitly said, Balatro is very much a love letter to American card culture. A game that dares to ask the question, what if there was a card game that involved literally every kind of card? The core gameplay involves the cards from one of these standard 52 card decks. As I discussed in an award-winning video I made quite a while ago, standard American playing cards with the 4 suits and all of that originated from late 15th century France, but similar forms of less standardized playing cards had been in Europe for centuries before then, and those cards in turn had been adapted from card games that had been imported from the Arab world, which were in turn probably adapted from card games imported from China. On this continent, our face cards are done up in this very iconic, hyper-stylized, pseudo-medieval woodblock looking way, which traces back to the designs of a very popular 19th century British card company called Charles Goodall & Sons that were later brought to the States. But what's interesting is that the face cards in Balatro are done in the original, more detailed French style, which is still how French playing cards look to this day. So that's a fun nod. On the reverse, the Balatro cards have a very busy design with 2 vaguely circular shapes. This feels like the sort of thing that most of us just take for granted is how the backs of cards are supposed to look, but it's actually a proprietary design that originates from the Bicycle brand card company. They were founded in 1885 in Cincinnati to sell British-style cards, and are today the largest card producer in the United States. Bicycle cards have always featured symmetrical circle-based designs on the back of their cards, intended to represent the 2 wheels of the bicycle, and indeed often feature artwork of bicycles on them, the bicycle being a very glamorous, newfangled invention of the time. By the way, when I talk about things like this, I am not implying that the Balatro creator, Local Thunk, was necessarily going out of his way to include all of these specific cultural callouts. In many ways, it's actually more interesting if a lot of the stuff in the game simply reflects the sort of cultural knowledge he takes for granted as being normal, as a product of American culture. Anyway, as Greg mentioned, the basic objective of Balatro is scoring points by making poker hands, combinations within 5 cards like pairs and 3 of a kinds and straights and all of that. Poker is an American game that originated from the southern US in the 1830s or so, and became very popular during the cowboy era of saloon gambling. Its reputation as the cool American game helped it build an increasingly large, increasingly global following throughout the 20th century, and it is now a mainstay of casinos all over the world. The idea that professional poker could be a competitive game that you could watch on TV first took off with the creation of the World Series of Poker, which was founded in Las Vegas in 1970. And of course, today we live in a world where every 25-year-old kid thinks that he can become an overnight millionaire playing competitive poker online, which first became a thing in the early 2000s. Online poker is actually often given credit for making real-life poker more popular over the last 20 years, rather than the other way around. You supplement your standard cards in Balatro by buying bonus decks from the in-game shop, which come in little packages that look like these. They are what we commonly refer to as foil packs because of the shiny paper they're made in. Foil started to become a popular way of packaging collectible cards in the late 1980s, reflecting recent innovations made in the technology of so-called metallized polymer film. Prior to that, cards usually came in packages made from waxed paper. The game calls these booster packs, which is a slang term originally used for gadgets you could use to make an electrical appliance like a TV or stereo work better. But then in the 1990s, the term started to be used as a pun to describe a pack of cards that you would buy for a trading card game. Trading card games, or TCGs, are themselves largely a creation of the 90s, and their rise can be credited to the popularity of 2 games in particular: Magic the Gathering, which was created by Dr. Garfield of Philadelphia in 1993, and Pokemon, which was a game from Japan brought to America in 1999 by the Wizards of the Coast, which was the same Seattle-based company that distributed Magic the Gathering. One of the Balatro Joker cards, in fact, is called a trading card and has a design that combines elements of Magic and Pokemon. And on that note, let us now pivot to talking about some of Balatro's other Joker cards, which, as Greg mentioned, are the main strategic linchpins of the game. The idea of putting a Joker, or two, into a deck of 52 standard playing cards originated in America, probably sometime in the 1870s, at least according to this guy, who has a whole website devoted to solving this particular cultural mystery. As far as he can tell, there is no obvious reason why Joker cards were created, other than to inspire creativity when making up new games. Balatro features 150 Joker cards in all, but let's just talk about a couple that I think are particularly worth reflecting on as artifacts of American culture. The credit card. Taking out loans or lines of credit from the bank to pay for things is a very old idea, but the idea of credit cards is something that American banks dreamed up in the aftermath of World War II. The post-war American boom had made Americans richer, which somewhat paradoxically meant that they could now also afford to buy things that they couldn't afford, simply because larger incomes made it easier to repay larger debts over time. The first ever credit card was released by the now defunct Franklin National Bank of New York in 1951, which was then copied by other banks, and then eventually large alliances of banks who started producing credit cards in conjunction with two big new corporations founded explicitly for this purpose: Visa and MasterCard. The first plastic credit cards debuted in 1959. Like all modern credit cards, the Balatro credit card has a gold EMV chip in it. This technology, which stores information about the cardholder, started being rolled out by the big credit card companies in the 2000s to replace the previous system where cardholder information was stored on a magnetic strip that had to be swiped. And before that technology was introduced in the 1960s, stores just had to make a carbon copy of your card using this weird contraption, and then mail that along with the receipt to your bank and hope that you weren't a deadbeat. The business card. The humble business card began life as a fairly elitist thing. In the late 18th and early 19th century, it was common for fancy people to leave cards with their names on it at the homes of other fancy people in order to let them prove to future guests that so-and-so had been there. These were known as calling cards, and it is from these that we get the modern expression of referring to proof of somebody's presence as being their calling card. Like, aha, a half-empty package of Zins on the kitchen counter. Truly Greg's trademark calling card. In the Victorian era, calling cards really exploded in popularity as printing and paper became cheaper and more accessible to middle-class people, who could now make their very own calling cards to promote themselves in any number of ways. Small business owners found them a good way to advertise, and of course, once telephones were invented, they became an essential way to remind people of how to stay in touch. In the latter half of the 20th century, American business card culture reached new heights as ever more advanced printing technology made wowing people with them an increasingly sophisticated and complicated art. I feel like social media has given them a new boost of relevance as well, since when you meet a new person, it is always useful to know what all of their usernames are. By the way, can you guess who are the single largest purchasers of business cards in the United States? That's right, real estate agents. The red card. The red card is one of the great symbols of professional soccer. When a player commits a truly inexcusable foul worthy of his immediate suspension from the game, the referee will dramatically flash a red card. This is an idea that was dreamed up by a British man named Ken Aston, who in the late 60s was serving as the head of referee instruction for FIFA. And here's how his brainstorm was described in his 2001 obituary in the New York Times. In 1966, after confusion at a World Cup game concerning disciplinary action by a referee, Aston came up with and pushed for the idea of showing a yellow card for an official caution and a red card for an ejection. He said the idea came to him while stopped at a traffic light. The cards were introduced at the 1970 World Cup finals and are used universally. Mr. Aston later moved to the US, where he continued to do soccer work and was considered an influential figure in the modest growth of interest in soccer that Americans experienced in the 80s and 90s. The card sharp. This one looks like that famous sketch of the Unabomber, but it's just supposed to be a professional poker player. At the highest level, competitive poker playing can be an extremely psychologically demanding game, since so much of poker is based around bluffing to the other players that you have a better or worse hand than you actually do, which makes concealing your emotions critical. And thus, in recent years, a lot of professional poker players have taken to wearing the two iconic articles of clothing seen here, sunglasses and a hoodie sweatshirt with the hood pulled up, in order to block out as many visible signs of your humanity as possible. The mail-in rebate. A mail-in rebate is a sort of old-fashioned after-the-fact coupon in which you mail a proof of purchase from some product, like a receipt or a barcode, back to the company, and then they mail you some money in return. In Balatro, the mail-in rebate is depicted as a US airmail envelope, which is a distinctive type of envelope with a white and blue border. Airmail began in the United States in 1918 and was initially an expensive luxury for sending letters to other countries much faster than could be done by ship. In 1928, the US Post Office, working closely with the main American envelope manufacturer of the day, unveiled a new envelope design intended to help postal workers identify and sort letters intended for airmail. A few other countries copied this system using their own patriotic colors on the border. You can still buy these envelopes to this day, though they're basically little more than a nostalgic novelty, since letters now are all sorted by machines. Well, to the extent that anyone is still even mailing letters. The baseball card. I spoke a bit about baseball cards in my video on presidential souvenirs of all things. Basically, they originate from a late 19th century tradition in America and Britain of putting colorful collectible cards in packages of candy, gum, and especially cigarettes as a fun little bonus prize. These cards were basically limitless in terms of the things that they would depict. Everything from pretty ladies with fans to the industries of Guatemala. But it was the ones featuring sports celebrities that proved to be the most popular, professional sports only having been recently invented. In the first half of the 20th century, some American gum companies decided that they could make more money just selling the cards directly, and they chose to focus on cards with baseball stars specifically, as that was the hottest sport of the time. Big League Chew is usually given the credit for being the first to sell dedicated packs of baseball cards in 1933, but it was the Topps Gum Company in 1952 who introduced the conventional sports card design that we know today, with the more rectangular shape and player data on the back. And now, of course, Topps has become this huge juggernaut of American culture, dominating the multi-billion-dollar industry of collectible sports celebrity cards, which now span all the major leagues. It is baseball cards, however, that continue to fetch the highest prices among collectors, with the most expensive sports card ever sold at auction being one of Topps' original 1952 cards of Mickey Mantle. It went for $12.6 million in 2022, the first time in American history that a sports card had cracked 8 figures. The Hanging Chad. This one is cool because it is based on such a particular moment from recent American history. The 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore was incredibly close and came down to the votes of a single state, Florida. Many counties in Florida at that time used these distinctive punch card ballots in which voters indicated their preference by using a stylus to punch out a tiny square of paper known as a chad, which created holes that were then counted by a special computer. The problem, however, was that sometimes people failed to punch the chads out completely, which left them hanging by an edge, which the computer would then ignore as valid votes, even though it was easy to argue that the voters' intention was clear. So as Florida plunged into a time-consuming manual recount to figure out who had actually won, these hanging chad ballots became a huge focus of national attention, and eventually a bit of a meme symbolizing just how chaotic and petty the aftermath of the election was getting. This embarrassment then led to Florida introducing a new statewide standardized ballot design in 2001. Never again will there be a hanging, dangling, or impregnated chad in the state of Florida, said the Florida Secretary of State in a statement that made a lot more sense at the time. The driver's license. Driver's licenses have been around in some form in America since the dawn of the 20th century, also known as the dawn of the motor car. In the early days, however, a driver's license was little more than a piece of cardboard. The modern American driver's license that we recognize today, a hard plastic card with your photograph on it, only started to be rolled out in the 70s and 80s. According to the Federal Department of Transportation, approximately 87% of Americans over the age of 16 have a driver's license, which is now also often used as most Americans' primary and in many cases only form of photographic ID. South Dakota was the last state to require drivers to have a license in 1954, and Tennessee was the last state to issue driver's licenses with photos on them in 1982. All right, so those were a few of my favorite jokers. But in addition to the jokers, Balatro also features a bunch of cards from 3 other decks: Tarot, Planets, and Spectrals. Tarot cards are one of the 2 15th century evolutionary paths of European playing cards. In the early days, the Europeans had an endless array of different styles of playing cards. But eventually, people wanted things to get more standardized and predictable so that everyone could play the same games. So from the initial chaos, we have one branch that leads to the standard French 52-card deck that we all know and love today. And then we have another branch leading to the much larger and more complicated tarot card deck that arose in Italy in the 1430s. And then from this evolved several other smaller decks that are still used in some European and Latin American countries to this day, but are less known to us. In the Anglo world, we associate tarot cards exclusively with fortune-telling, mysticism, and the occult, but in Europe, they've historically just been used as ordinary playing cards for different sorts of games, and still are to a fading degree. Tarot cards didn't really come to Britain and America until the turn of the last century, which also happened to be a time in which interest in the occult and card-based fortune-telling had become a major craze, and thus tarot cards have always held a quite distinctive cultural significance over here. In Balatro, there are 22 tarot cards, all of which take the form of the so-called major arcana cards, which are those richly illustrated picture cards that most lay people will recognize. The minor arcana cards are just the boring kings, queens, and numbers and all of that, which are less well known outside of the tarot fandom. The iconic designs that we in the Anglo world associate with the major arcana come from a very famous tarot deck that was first released in 1909 and has been reprinted endlessly ever since, the so-called Rider-Waite or Smith-Waite deck. A British guy named Arthur Waite commissioned a British woman named Pamela Colman Smith to design a set of tarot cards that would be explicitly occultist in design, since they were both really into that sort of thing. So Pamela stuck in a bunch of symbolism relating to Egypt and the Bible and ancient Jews and so on. And thus, an enormous new reservoir of cultural symbolism for the Goth set was born. Balatro's planet and spectral cards, meanwhile, I believe are supposed to evoke the idea of what are called oracle decks. These are the sorts of cards you'll often see for sale at your local woo-woo store. They usually have pictures of planets and constellations and stuff like that, and are used in all sorts of different ways by people who are into New Age spiritualism of one form or another. So like I can pull out a card and be like, aha, it is Pluto, the final planet. That means we are coming to the end of the video. So, I hope you enjoyed this little tour through some of my favorite Balatro cards and their cultural significance. Like I said at the start, even though I am not much of a gamer myself, I have been very much enjoying the rise of Americana-core indie games as an exciting new genre, and I am proud that we Canadians have played such a large role contributing to it. If you know any other cool indie games that you think might fit into this category and might make for a good video, let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.